My father kicked me out of the house with the DNA papers while my golden brother smiled, but no one taught him how to read the paternity results, and he misinterpreted them completely. I'll never forget that night. The night my whole world turned upside down. At the time, I was 23 years old, still trying to figure out what the hell I was doing with my life. If you'd asked me, I probably would have said I was doing okay, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I had this constant feeling of being, well, out of place. Like I wasn't really part of my own family. That's a hard thing to explain, but it's exactly how I felt. It wasn't that my parents were bad people, but my dad, Roberto, well, he had a way of making me feel invisible. My brother, Vinicius, who was 3 years older than me, was the golden child. Always the one Dad was proud of. Always the one who could do no wrong. And I was just there. I tried everything to get his attention. I studied hard. I tried to be the perfect daughter, whatever that even meant. But no matter how hard I worked, it felt like I was always falling short. If I ever did something good, it was like Dad couldn't even bring himself to look up from his newspaper to notice. On the other hand, when Vinicius did something, even if it was just showing up to the dinner table, Dad would beam with pride like he was the next Einstein. So yeah, the vibe at home wasn't great. There was a lot of tension under the surface, but I tried to keep my head down and get through the days. Then came that night. It started like any other awkward family dinner. Mom Carla had made pasta, her way of keeping things normal, I guess. But even the smell of garlic and olive oil couldn't mask the heaviness in the air. Roberto was picking at his food, barely speaking, while Vinicius sat there, casually, scrolling through his phone, looking bored. I don't even know what it was that set him off, but at some point, Roberto suddenly dropped a pile of papers onto the table. It was so abrupt. The sound of those papers hitting the wood made my heart skip a beat. I know the truth, he said, his voice cold. You're not my daughter, Lucia. At first, I thought I misheard him. My stomach churned. I looked up, trying to read his face, but his eyes were like steel. I swear I saw something flicker in his eyes, some weird mixture of anger and triumph. He pushed the papers toward me. DNA test results. Proof, apparently, that I wasn't his flesh and blood. He went on to say that Mom had had an affair. That I was the product of that affair, and he'd known it all along. He said he'd always known I didn't belong to him, and that's why he treated me the way he had. That I had always been a disappointment to him. I felt like someone had punched me in the gut. My body went numb. I didn't even know what to say. Mom, who was sitting next to me, didn't say a word. Not one. She just sat there staring at the table, her eyes brimming with tears. And Vinicius, my brother, who had always been the one I thought I could count on, he was smirking. I swear he looked like he was enjoying this, like he was watching a reality TV show, something to entertain him after a long day. I wanted to scream at him, to demand why he wasn't standing up for me, but I couldn't find my voice. I looked at my mom. Mom, is this true? I couldn't stop the desperation from seeping into my voice, but she didn't answer. She just wiped a tear away and kept looking at the table like it was more interesting than the mess unfolding right in front of us. And that's when it hit me. She wasn't going to defend me. She wasn't going to do anything to protect me. Roberto, practically seething, stood up from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Get out, he barked. I don't want you here. Leave. Now. I froze. My mind couldn't process it. I didn't have anywhere to go. I didn't have any plan. I had no idea what to do or where to turn. I glanced at Vinicius again, hoping he'd finally show some compassion, maybe even throw me a lifeline. But he just kept his gaze fixed on his phone as if he hadn't heard a thing. I stood up, my legs shaking. Mom, please, I whispered, my voice barely a breath. But she didn't move, didn't say anything. In that moment, I realized I had nothing left. No family, no place where I belonged. The one person who should have been there for me, the woman who gave birth to me, was too busy trying to keep the peace with the man who had never once loved me. I grabbed my jacket, and without a word, I walked out of that house. The cold air hit me like a slap in the face when I stepped outside. It felt like the whole world was closing in on me, like everything I'd ever known was slipping through my fingers. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know what was going to happen to me next. But I couldn't stay there anymore. Not in that house where I wasn't wanted, where I never felt like I belonged. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, walking away from everything I'd known, from the family I thought was mine. But in that moment, I realized that it was the only way I could begin to figure out who I really was. The days after I left home were a blur of fog and silence. I had nowhere to go, no one to turn to except Sophia. She was the one person who didn't look at me like I was a problem or a mistake. Sophia was a good friend, the kind of person who could make you laugh even when you didn't feel like smiling. So, when I showed up at her door that cold night, tears streaking my face, she didn't question me. She just opened her arms and pulled me in. Her apartment was small, but it felt like a sanctuary to me. It wasn't much. A tiny living room with mismatched furniture, a half-used candle on the coffee table, and her worn-out sneakers by the door. But it was safe. That was all I cared about. The first few days I barely spoke. I didn't eat. I just sat in the corner of the couch, staring at the wall, as if I could will myself out of this nightmare. I didn't know what to do with myself, how to piece the broken parts of me back together. Sophia tried everything, asking me about my day, trying to get me to eat, even putting on the cheesiest rom-coms in an effort to pull me out of my shell. But nothing worked. I was dead inside, floating through time like I wasn't really there. The days blurred into one another, and each morning felt like a heavy weight on my chest. I'd wake up, lie there for hours, and wonder what the point of it all was. The whole world felt like a lie, and I was drowning in it. The one thing that kept me anchored to the mess I had left behind was the stack of DNA test papers. They sat on the small desk in Sophia's apartment, untouched. I knew I had to face them eventually, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. The idea of looking at those papers, of seeing the concrete proof of my father's betrayal, was terrifying. What would I find? Would it make everything worse? Or would it make the reality of it all so real, I wouldn't know how to breathe? Every time I thought about reading them, my stomach clenched in knots. I was terrified that seeing that confirmation would be the final nail in the coffin, the last shred of connection I had to the family I'd always wanted to believe in. But there was no running away from it forever. After days of spiraling deeper into myself, I finally reached for the papers one morning, the sunlight filtering weakly through Sophia's curtains. My hands shook as I spread them out in front of me, one by one. The words blurred together, but I forced myself to focus, and then I saw it. The truth was right there in black and white. The DNA tests weren't even about me. They were about Vinicius. I had spent days, weeks, torturing myself over the idea that I wasn't a part of the family, that I was the outsider. But the truth was even worse. Vinicius wasn't even Dad's son. The golden boy, the one who could do no wrong in Roberto's eyes, was not his son. My mind raced. It felt like the room was spinning. The words on the page blurred in and out of focus, but the gravity of the discovery hit me like a freight train. Roberto's entire life, his whole identity as a father, was built on a lie. The son he adored, the one he treated like a prince, was actually the product of his own infidelity. He had raised a child that wasn't even his. I couldn't breathe. The anger that had been simmering inside of me suddenly erupted. My hands clenched into fists, and I slammed the papers back down on the desk, my heart pounding in my ears. All this time, I had been the one who was made to feel worthless. I was the one who was rejected. But Vinicius was the one who had never belonged. And yet, it was me who had been pushed to the edge, to the point where I felt like I had nothing left. How could they have done this to me? How could my mother have stayed silent all these years, letting me believe the lies they told, letting me suffer in the shadows while she knew the truth? I thought about the years I spent trying to prove myself to Roberto, trying to make him love me, only to realize he had never even wanted me. I wasn't his. But neither was Vinicius. The truth hit me like a slap in the face, but it wasn't just anger anymore. It was a sick feeling of betrayal, deeper than anything I had ever felt. I wanted to scream, to burn the papers, to do something, to make it all go away, but I couldn't. I was stuck, tangled in the mess of it all. I thought about what this meant. If I told people, if I exposed the truth, everything would fall apart. Vinicius, my brother, would lose everything. The love of a father, the image of a perfect family. And me? What would I have left? What would I become if I did that? Would I ever be able to look at anyone the same way again? But then there was a part of me, an angry, raw part of me, that couldn't sit with the idea of keeping this secret any longer. Roberto and Carla had used me. They had built their little world on lies and silence, and they had kept me in the dark for years. I wasn't going to stand for it anymore. I had been the scapegoat, the punching bag, the one who took all the blame. But now, The truth was in my hands. I didn't know what to do with it yet, but one thing was clear. I wasn't going to stay quiet. Not anymore. The anger was burning in my chest, and it felt good. For the first time in weeks, I felt alive. I wasn't going to let Roberto's lies stand, and I wasn't going to let my mother off the hook for her silence. It was time for the truth to come out. I didn't know how I was going to do it, or what the consequences would be, but I knew one thing for sure. I was done being the victim. It was time to turn the tables. The days after I found out the truth felt like a slow-motion roller coaster, every minute dragging me deeper into a web of anger and desire for revenge. I couldn't stop thinking about how I could tear apart the facade my family had built for so long. It was like a switch had flipped in me, and I couldn't ignore the power I held now. I knew that the truth about Vinicius wasn't just some juicy secret. It was a wrecking ball, one that could destroy everything. I didn't want to be consumed by this rage, but it was like a wildfire burning through me. Every time I thought about how I had been treated, how we had been treated, I felt that familiar ache in my chest. But it wasn't sadness anymore. It was cold fury. I could feel the walls closing in on me, and I knew that whatever happened. Next, there was no turning back. The first thing I did was start planning. Step 1, confront my mother. It had been so long since I had an honest conversation with her. Hell, it had been so long since I felt like she was my mother. Growing up, it was like I was living in some shadow of a family, always walking on eggshells, wondering what I had done wrong. I needed answers. No more silence. No more avoiding the hard stuff. One night, after dinner, when the house was quiet, and the air felt heavy with unspoken things, I sat my mother down. She was still the same, wearing her tired, apologetic smile, the one that always made me feel like I was a problem she had to handle. But this time, I wasn't going to let it slide. "Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I need you to answer me. Why did you let this happen? All these years I've been thinking I was the problem, that I was the reason I didn't belong in this family. But you knew, didn't you? You knew the truth all along." She flinched, her hands trembling as she folded them in her lap. For a second, I thought she was going to lie, but she didn't. Instead, she looked down, guilt washing over her like a tide. And that's when it all came out. "I didn't know who Vinicius's father was, Lucia," she whispered, her voice breaking. I just knew I wasn't happy with Roberto. He wasn't the man I thought he was, and I wanted something more. Someone who saw me. And when I found someone who did, She paused, swallowing hard. "I got pregnant. But I didn't have the guts to tell Roberto the truth, and I never thought it would get this far." I sat there, shocked into silence. This wasn't just about me. It was about her, too. About how she had spent her whole life choosing to live in this toxic relationship, keeping me trapped in the same web of lies. I always thought she was just passive, that she had no power to change anything. But the truth was, she had made choices, bad ones, and I had paid the price. She went on, the guilt spilling out like a dam breaking, explaining how the years had turned into decades of compromise and fear, how she had become a prisoner of her own choices, unable to leave Roberto despite the affair, despite everything. She had lost herself in this marriage, and in the process, she had sacrificed me. I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. All my life, I had thought she was just a weak, silent figure. But now, I saw the truth. She was weak because she had never fought for me. She had let me become a casualty in this toxic war of love and hate she had with my father. She had never once chosen me over him, over their miserable marriage. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her how much she had ruined me, how much she had allowed me to feel invisible. But I couldn't. I couldn't even cry. All I could do was look at her and feel the weight of everything I'd been carrying for so long. "That's the problem, Mom," I said, my voice cold. "You never fought for me. You fought for your marriage, your perfect little world, and I was the one who had to live in it. I had to be the one who paid the price for your choices." She broke down then, her face crumpling in shame and sorrow, but it was too late. I was done. I didn't know if I could ever forgive her. I didn't know if I even wanted to. Things at home started to change after that night. I was no longer the quiet, obedient daughter. I had my eyes wide open, and I wasn't afraid to stir the pot. Roberto, for one, could feel the shift. He'd always been the alpha in the house, but now I could see the cracks forming in his armor. He started watching me more closely, like a predator sniffing out danger. I could tell he knew something was off, even if he didn't know the whole truth yet. There were these subtle moments, his eyes darting to the papers I had left on the kitchen counter, his voice getting sharper whenever I responded to him. He was scared. I could smell it. The once confident man who had always held all the cards now felt like he was on the losing side. But the more I watched him, the more I realized how far he would go to protect his image, to keep the family intact. No matter the cost. And I couldn't just let him get away with it anymore. The power I had over him, over all of them, was intoxicating. Vinicius, on the other hand, was starting to crumble. The pedestal I had put him on all these years had cracked, and he was beginning to see the truth for what it was. His once perfect life was starting to unravel. I could see the doubt in his eyes when he looked at me now, like he was piecing together the puzzle he'd never wanted to solve. I could tell he was afraid, but that only made me more determined. I wasn't going to let this family continue pretending everything was fine. They had lied to me, used me, and I was going to make sure the truth came out. It was time for them all to face the music. And when they did, they wouldn't be able to run. The day had arrived. I had carefully planned it all, every move, every word, every possible reaction. The air in the house felt thick, like I was about to ignite some kind of bomb. I had spent days, weeks, even months stewing over it. But now it was time to face them, my so-called family. The people who had lied to me, manipulated me, treated me like I was a problem to be hidden away, not a person to be loved. I called a family meeting. I could already feel the tension rising as I sent out the invites. Hey, we need to talk. All of us. I didn't say much more than that. The silence on the other end of the line said it all. They were nervous. And they should have been. When everyone finally arrived, I could see the unease in their eyes. Roberto was already pacing back and forth like a caged animal. Vinicius had this air of arrogance still hanging on, but I could see the cracks forming. Carla looked like she had aged a decade in the last few days, all her guilt and regret wearing her down. But none of it mattered anymore. I wasn't here to make them comfortable. I wasn't here to hold their hands. I took a deep breath and laid the papers on the table. The same DNA test results that had started this whole mess. I could see Roberto's eyes widen, his throat tightening. He knew this wasn't going to go the way he wanted. You've been lying to me, to all of us for years, I started, keeping my voice steady, but there was a fire burning in my chest now. Vinicius isn't your son, Roberto. He never was. These are the results. You're not his father. The silence was deafening. The air felt like it could shatter at any second. Roberto's face went ashen. I could practically see the wheels turning in his head, trying to wrap his mind around the fact that everything he'd built his identity on was a lie. No, he muttered, shaking his head, his voice trembling with disbelief. No, this isn't possible. But it was, and it was too late to deny it now. Vinicius, the golden child, the one who had always basked in Roberto's favoritism, looked like he'd just been slapped across the face. His cocky demeanor faltered for the first time in his life. I could see him struggling to process it, the hero of the family, the one everyone looked up to, now realizing that his pedestal had been nothing more than a house of cards. What the hell is this? Vinicius said, his voice uncharacteristically small, his hands shaking. I just looked at him, emotionless. This is the truth. And you have no idea what it feels like to be raised in a family full of lies. All these years, you've been the favorite. The one with the perfect life. But now, you were never a part of this family either, not really. The room went dead silent again, and the tension could have been cut with a knife. Roberto, ever the control freak, tried to regain his composure, but it was clear he was unraveling. I could see the panic in his eyes. He was desperately trying to cling to whatever was left of his fragile image, but it was no use. That's when I decided to turn the knife a little more. There's more, I said, my voice almost a whisper, but I knew it would hit harder this way. Do you really want to know what else has been going on? You think this is just about Vinicius? No, it's about everything you've buried for years. What if I told you that you're not the only man in this family who's been sleeping around? I let those words hang in the air like poison slowly seeping into their veins. I watched as Roberto's face twisted, his mouth opening, but no words coming out. I had him right where I wanted him. What if I told you that my real father might be David? I dropped the bomb. What if Vinicius isn't just your son, but also your nephew? What if all of this was a house of lies built on something darker? The shock on their faces was indescribable. It was like the ground had opened up beneath them, and they were all falling. Carla was pale, her lips trembling. Vinicius was frozen, in place, eyes wide, like he'd just seen a ghost. And Roberto? He looked like he was about to collapse. The room erupted into chaos. Screams, shouted accusations. Roberto tried to take control, but it was obvious he couldn't. Nothing he said made any sense anymore. Carla, face streaked with tears, tried to apologize, but nothing could fix what had been broken. The carefully constructed world they had built, this twisted, toxic family dynamic, was crumbling in front of our eyes. At that moment, I realized how little it mattered to me anymore. Sure, this was about revenge, but it was also about something much bigger. It was about the freedom I would feel after this. The freedom to finally step away from the wreckage and never look back. And as the house descended into madness, I knew this was it. This was the end of everything. I didn't stay for long after that day. I watched as they fought it out among themselves, each one grappling with the aftermath of everything I had exposed. Roberto and Carla's marriage, if you could even call it that, collapsed under the weight of their lies. They separated, filed for divorce, and I could hear the bitter words through the thin walls of the house. Vinicius? He was lost, completely. Without his father's approval and without the image of the perfect family, he had no identity left. I couldn't bring myself to care, though. He had always been the golden boy, the one everyone felt sorry for me for resenting. But now I could see the cracks in his armor, and I knew that deep down he was just as broken as I had always been. As for me, I was done. I walked away from that house and never looked back. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get out. I stayed with Sophia for a while longer, but even that felt temporary. In time, I found my own place, my own rhythm. I focused on myself for the first time in years. I started to rebuild, piece by piece. It wasn't easy, though. It never is when you've spent your whole life holding on to toxic people. But every step I took away from that mess, I felt lighter, freer. The anger, the bitterness, it slowly faded as I moved forward. And though I knew I had gotten my revenge, there was something bittersweet about it. Watching your family tear apart isn't exactly satisfying. It's just empty. I was free now, but a part of me knew that the scars of what I'd done and what had been done to me would follow me for the rest of my life.